Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for part 3 of our 5-part series about 100 artifacts that we featured in our 100 Artifacts for 100 Years exhibit. The exhibit is currently on view here at the museum until February of 2026, and it is our way of celebrating the museum's 100th anniversary as an institution, which began with the creation of the museum committee among the Paterson Free Public Library board members in February of 1925. I'm Heather Garside, the museum's curator, and here with me is the museum's director, Giacomo DeStefano. And today we're going to focus on the stories of the artifacts numbered 41 through 60. Now, this program is being recorded, and you'll be able to view it on YouTube after. Give us about a week to get it together, and I'll share more of those details on how you would find it at the end of the program. And if this is the first of these programs that you're tuning into and you're going, what? You're starting in the middle. Programs parts 1 and 2 are also on our YouTube channel. All right, let's get started. You ready, Jack?
I'm ready.
Okay. The PowerPoint's not ready. Come on. Doesn't want to advance. Hang on. Sorry. Didn't want to advance for some reason.
We're gonna have to act it out.
I hope not. Hang on. My computer's been real touchy lately. Sorry.
This was working really well in practice.
There we go. All right. There we go. Sorry, everybody.
Okay, I started off. I think one of the most iconic institutions in the city of Paterson was always Libby's Lunch. Homes for the world famous, getting your hot dog all the way, with the chili sauce. This particular pot, this is a 28, I think it's about 25 to 26 quarts could fill this saucepan, which I know was used constantly, at least since the 1980s, because I knew one of the artists that when he saw it on display, who lived in the artist housing, said, "That's from Libby's." He goes, "We used to make the chili sauce in there." Next, Heather. Again, Libby's Lunch was established in Paterson by Bill Pappas in 1936, and it ran continuously on the site right adjacent to the Passaic River up into 2000. Actually, I think the last day was July 31st, and it happened to be a Saturday, and it was fortunate that I was at the museum because I got the call from the family that was running the running Libby's at the end, and they said, "If there's anything you want, you got to come right now."
You
So
mean 2020, not 2000, 2020.
2020. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's what I meant. What did I say? 2000?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I knew the 2 and a 0 over there. Thank you, Heather. Oh my God, I'm drawing a blank what the chef's name was. On a great day, he said he produced 128 quarts of Libby's famous chili sauce out of that pan. You really got to come see it in person because that metal stick he's holding really looks like an oar. That was the paddle used, for stirring the sauce, and to look inside to see how the heat really transformed the bottom. It almost looks like a 3-section relief in there from the obviously continuous spinning of it. And get you a look at it really was a greasy spoon in the back, I got to be honest. But this is only one of the many artifacts we're able to collect. We got a variety of saucepans, but again, this would have been the most famous. Next slide. And while I was there, I brought my camera. I was documenting. Literally, they're taking all the signs down. Actually, the signs in the back that have the prices, those are also in the museum's collection. And again, this is literally the last day because by an hour after these photos were taken and we picked up what we needed, they locked the doors and the building was closed for a number of years. It's only just recently opened up as the Silk City Cafe. So a little bit different fare, but it's still welcoming people back. The next slide, I think, really has the ultimate trivia question, which I'll share with you. What was the last meal at Libby's? It was not a Libby's hot dog all the way or a cheeseburger all the way or a beef barbecue. It was Soprano's Pizza that the crew and family brought in to have the last lunch there. So there's a little bit of trivia you wouldn't know. You're up, Heather.
Yep. So for artifact 42, we included this photograph, which is very interesting. We included it for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons that we included it is for its odd size and shape. These long panoramic group shots were really popular for company outings, military encampments, and other like large group meetups, probably from, I would say at least 1900 to 1940s. It might be earlier than that. And you can find them in museums and historical societies all over the country. And often they're a very unique size, which makes them an interesting artifact. And from a collections management perspective, um, they're really a pain. They're very difficult to care for because of their odd size. Often they have a custom frame, so if that breaks, you're kind of stuck. And many of these photos actually come to the museum not framed, but rolled up in a tube. And depending on their age and particularly the conditions in which they were stored, if they were kept in an attic or got really warm, unrolling those can be a real challenge in terms of being very dangerous to the picture. They can crack a lot and be very brittle, so it makes it very difficult. This particular photograph depicts the officers and non-commissioned officers of the 6th Infantry New Jersey National Guard, and they are at a camp of instruction, and the photo is dated June of 1920. The New Jersey National Guard was formed from the Militia and Rifle Corps in 1869, and they spent their first summer on the Jersey Shore in 1884 at Manasquan. In 1885, they moved the camp location to Seagirt and leased land there that was used for both the National Guard encampments and the Grand Army of the Republic for their annual encampments. And here is a page from the Sanborn map of Seagirt from 1905 so that you can see the grounds that were used for the encampment. I've put them in a box. And then here I've actually just enlarged that same image. You can see that there are a few permanent buildings, the yellow buildings, are located on the site, including the mess hall. Now, the yellow buildings means that they were made of wood, which is probably not surprising. Following World War I, recruitment for the New Jersey National Guard was increased. And this was part of a nationwide initiative to rebuild the available forces for potential future conflicts. But the recruiters found recruitment very, very difficult. Many of the older men who had survived World War I, whether they'd served or just experienced it on the home front, were not super keen on signing up for any sort of military service. So they really struggled to find people to fill the ranks. And one of the ways that they tried to incentivize joining the National Guard, at least in New Jersey, was focusing on the fact, and this is a quote from one of the articles, Uncle Sam offers you 2 weeks at the seashore, all expenses paid. So here on the top, we can see an article from the Paterson Morning Call, and this is dated from Friday, May 7th, 1920, and it indicates that Company F of the 6th Infantry was to be filled with 100 Paterson men, and they currently had 80 signed up and still were looking for 20 more people to join their ranks. That article also mentions a summer vacation at expense of the state. So again, they're really pushing that vacation aspect of it, going down to the shore. Now, the second image you see down below is a postcard image of the summer encampment of 1924, and that's from the New Jersey Archive. As we saw from the article in the last slide, the 6th Infantry was newly formed in 1920. The infantry included men from 7 New Jersey counties, including Passaic. Paterson men were in Company F, and there may have been some Paterson men in Company E as well, definitely Greater Paterson. According to my reading, it seems to have been reorganized shortly after being formed, and the infantry was assigned a different number. But honestly, researching this topic, I found the organizing and reorganizing of the different regiments and companies to be really complicated. And I hadn't anticipated that. But if you're interested in learning more about the history of the National Guard in New Jersey, the National Guard Militia Museum in New Jersey is actually located at Seagirt, and it's a great place to start. I actually met their director curator, Staff Sergeant Andrew Walker, at a New Jersey Association of Museums event, and he's really knowledgeable and very friendly. And the museum also has a lot of great resources just available on their website, which is where I found a lot of the information I shared with you today. So this is just showing a few details of the picture, because with it being so long, it's kind of hard to get it up close. You can see how they labeled it in white, so we know what we're looking at, camp of instruction for officers and non-commissioned officers, and then the drum I blew up so we can see the regimental information. And I just kind of I mentioned that we picked this for a bunch of reasons, and I talked about the shape and the size and the type of artifact. But one of the other reasons that I picked this photo is I just find it very compelling, and the ability to kind of make contact with these people in the past. Now, we don't know any of their names, but when you look at their faces, you kind of feel like you can relate to them and understand them a little bit. And also just look how young some of these guys look. This picture really like is a visual confirmation, I think, that they were recruiting very young. Um, and and that was a compensation because they couldn't find older people who were interested. I mean, look at this little guy right next to the drum. He doesn't even look like he's old enough to have joined. And again, just another close up. Now, one interesting article that I encountered in my quest to find out a little bit more of information about the 6th Infantry was an article printed on in the Morning Call, July 14th, 1920. And this article talked about 15 men who belonged to companies E and F that had failed to show up to Seeger. Now, in what we have a photo of is in June, that's the officers specifically. And then they would have the full encampment for all of the enlisted men in July, is from what I can tell. So they had to send officers to Paterson to round up the guys that hadn't shown up without permission. And as they caught them and found them, they actually held them in jail at the armory in Paterson, which we see pictured here, until they had them all. And then they marched them down to Seeger to participate in their 2-week muster. So our next artifact is Dublin Spring by Gaetano Federici. Now, this is not the final version of the sculpture, as many of you may know, but rather a plaster model that was made during the development of the final version. Gaetano Federici was born in Italy in 1880, and he came to Paterson with his family when he was 7 years old. His father and his brothers were masons, but Gaetano was much more interested in adorning buildings than constructing them, so he apprenticed as a sculptor, and that career lasted him over 50 years. He's very well known for the intimate details that he's able to develop in his sculptures, particularly in faces and hands. And we can definitely see the intimacy and the detail of the face of the Dublin Spring Boy, and particularly his smile. One of the ways that Federici was able to achieve these details was by developing many models before settling on the final version. So often, particularly with his large scale memorials and monuments like the Nathan Barnard statue outside of City Hall, he would start very, very small scale and then progressively work up. And as he worked up, he would scale up the details. And that was one of the ways that he was able to get so many details so specific. He became very, very well known in Paterson. And in fact, he's known today kind of unofficially as the sculptor laureate of Paterson. Vince Perillo did a documentary on him. There's a book about him from, I think, 1980 or 1985 from the Historical Society. And his notoriety is greatly due to the large number of public commissions that he completed during his career. His first, or at least one of his earliest, I couldn't completely confirm that this was his first, was in 1905. And his commissions would go on to spread around our community, not just in parks and cemeteries, but also inside and outside school buildings, in civil buildings, and in sports arenas. Dublin Spring is one of those public commissions. It was completed in 1931, and the statue was originally located on the corner of Oliver Street and Mill Street. On the back, it reads, erected by the Dublin Spring Association, near the site of the old Dublin Spring. The statue was erected in the Dublin neighborhood, which was predominantly Irish American in the late 1800s. And it was placed near the spot of a spring where people used to collect drinking water. Now, the spring had been capped in the 1890s because of health concerns. And so this statue was meant to sort of commemorate that former location. On the final version of the statue, which you can kind of see in this picture, you see that the boy has a canteen in his hand, and there's actually a dog looking up at him from further down the pillar, hoping to kind of catch a drip from the canteen. And the front of the monument has 2 words. It says, no more. The sculpture on exhibit at the museum only portrays the top. It only has the boy from his base up. In 1991, the monument was actually moved to its current location where we photographed it for these pictures, which is just a little bit further up Oliver Street. In 2023, Robert Conti visited the museum kind of out of the blue and asked if he could see the Dublin Spring statue. Now, it wasn't on view at the time, so we brought it out for him to see into the main gallery, and he told us this amazing story. The original location of the statue was outside of his grandfather, Domenico Conti's grocery store and home at 93 Mill Street. And the two photographs you see here on the right are Domenico and his wife Maria standing next to the statue around 1948 in front of their store. When Domenico died in 1954, his obituary claimed him as the Dublin Spring Keeper. And it actually went on, and this is a quote from it, to say, the late Mr. Conti regarded his guardianship of the Dublin Spring Monument with intense pride, as he did the special police privileges which were made a prerogative of the duties he voluntarily assumed a long generation ago. He frequently entertained mischievous boys with folklore of the famous springs. But the Conti connection to the statue actually goes much deeper, and it's really interesting. Beyond protecting it, during his visit, Robert shared with us that his father, Charles, when he was a boy, was a model for the water boy who is on top of the Dublin Spring Monument. The family story is that Federici, who frequented the grocery store, saw Charles playing and decided to use him as a model for the water boy. So that's not like that far-fetched of a story, to be honest, because there's a lot of stories of Federici kind of pulling neighbors and particularly neighbors' children in off the street and kind of asking them to model for various sculptures that he was doing, whether they were paid commissions or not. But it's really neat that he picked somebody so closely located to the physical location where the statue was going to be. Now, since Robert's visit, we've actually also made connection completely separately with his cousin, Catherine Conti Salomon, who details this story in her memoir that she wrote. She wrote a book about growing up in Paterson, which is known as the title of her book is Sewn in Silk City, A Life Rooted in Paterson, New Jersey. And I recently was able to have an interview conversation with her, which we recorded, about her childhood and publishing her book. And that's actually available right now on the museum's YouTube channel. And that includes a little bit more her own words about this story. And these are her photos of her grandparents. So thank her very much, Catherine, for letting us use those today.
Heather, I got one question. Isn't Domenico Conti also famous for naming the submarine sandwich in 1928?
That was another story we heard. So I don't know. There are many places that claim the submarine sandwich. So I don't know about that one.
I think we hold it there. I guess this piece is a one-off Silk City wallpaper. This was donated to us by a gentleman who said it was woven in Paterson, and it was really when they were doing the interior design for City Hall, or one of the renovations of it. It was never used. I mean, this was lovingly cared for. This is how it came to us. It was already a padded silk example and framed. And it's also, quite appropriate for the Silk City to have a woven silk product, as well as the actual city logo, which is a gentleman planting the mulberry tree. It's off of the leaves of the mulberry leaf that the silkworm feeds off of and spins its cocoon. So really, the wealth of the city of Paterson was based on that. And then more importantly, this was done at the insistence of John Ryle in 1869 when he was mayor. John Ryle is actually the founder of the silk industry. He originally came from Macclesfield, England, and he was the one to first successfully spin silk onto bobbins in the spring 1839, 1840. Unfortunately, it was never used in the interior design. Next slide. Interesting enough, for all the photos we have, and we do have about 250,000 photographs and negatives, when we were researching for this, I couldn't find an interior shot of the mayor's office. So I think the next time we're there, we have to go in there and photograph it. This is the city council chambers, which most people are more familiar with. Again, it would have been appropriate to be there as well, but unfortunately, it just didn't get its just due. Continuing with the City Hall. Now, the City Hall itself was built in 1896. And really, this was a monument that came after the celebration of our 100th anniversary. They put the Centennial Committee together, and one of the charges they had was to build an appropriate City Hall for the stature that the city actually enjoyed. This is part of the copper dome. Originally, it would have been copper color. As you know, that brownish, shiny dome was, built of a fabric that would later turn to this green patina. Actually, the largest dome that should be green in the city is the county courthouse. Unfortunately, the county painted it white once, and now it's painted brown to replicate what copper should look like. But even the designers of the day, they would have made the copper to oxidize to give it this green patina. Give it a better example of exactly where it's, displayed on the city hall on the top of the bell tower. And this bell tower is really the one that's modeled after the bell tower of the Capitol building in Lyon, France, as Paterson's also the Lyon of the New World, and in Lyon is where jacquard weaving begins.
Okay. These face masks were selected as a part of this exhibit because they represent the museum's need to actively collect in real time. One of the most challenging parts of my job, I think, is real-time collecting, if I'm honest. And and if we're all honest with ourselves, we'll admit that there's a very fine line between collecting and hoarding, right, Jack? And so so um knowing what's going to prove important to preserve for future generations as it's kind of happening in real time is a very big challenge. And we can't save everything. We couldn't save everything even if we had infinite space, which we certainly don't have here at the Paterson Museum. However, there are some moments and events, such as the pandemic that happened in 2020, that are unquestionably significant. And when you're in them, you know there's sort of a major event for the world or where you are. So during the pandemic, the museum collected many items that focused on the experience of the pandemic in Paterson. Among the items that we collected were these masks, which were produced by LBU Incorporated. LBU is located on 4th Avenue here in Paterson, and the company produces cut and sewn promotional products, including cloth bags, handbags, totes, backpacks, and cosmetic bags. Oops. Um, by mid-March of 2020, the LBU had reacted to the need for masks during the pandemic, and they transitioned to start making masks. They produced both cloth masks and medical gowns. And as you can see here from the masks in the previous picture that we selected, their clients included major corporations like Google, Dunkin' Donuts. One of them is for the White House. These two images, which were featured in NorthJersey.com, were part of an article talking about LBU's responsive transition to making masks, and they kind of show the process at the time. Now, after reading about their mask production in the news during the pandemic, I reached out to the company and asked them if they would share some of their examples for our permanent collection. And they sent us approximately 20 of these different masks to include in our collection, which we're very grateful that they did so. And these items, along with other photographs and artifacts, were collected during the pandemic, will allow us to share the stories of the COVID-19 pandemic with future generations.
Meyer Brothers box. The premier shopping experience in northern New Jersey really was Paterson's downtown. And there's really no way to, preserve everything. And it's from this humble little box that we talked like one of the two main stores that you came to Paterson would either be Quackenbush or Meyer Brothers, the Boston store. Actually, all of the stores that you see in the downtown area were really rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1902. Many of these buildings, that the stores were there in the 1890s, all went up in flames. So we used to really reflect the Beaux Art movement throughout. It wasn't that it was planned that way, but an atrocity that changed everything. The box from Meyer Brothers gave you like white glove service. I recall going as a child. You'd have all the glass counters. There would be the women that worked behind the counters, and they did literally wear white gloves. This box typically would be used for whether you're buying a pair of silk stockings, a silk scarf, Everything had its own unique packaging, and it was hand packaged right in front of you. You liked your scarf, it would be brought out to you. If you were interested in it and you said yes, the woman would box it right in front of you. Next slide. Just give you an idea. The biggest thing, actually, it's a little hard to see in this in the center shot there, but you see the clock. It's a little circle. I remember those big clocks. There were a couple of large clocks, and the main time that you really caught attention to them was right after Thanksgiving, and the giant garland that used to decorate the entire, shopping experience. This is when Christmas really began. Was when you went to Meyer Brothers and the decoration. Unfortunately, the building did suffer a major fire in the early 90s, and actually we had lost a fireman, John Nicosia, who I actually went to high school with, and he taught me how to play pool at the boys club. So, Meyer Brothers has, bittersweet memories for me sometimes, but what an elegant time. And you could see it was the store to go to. Just look at the photo and the crowds that they used to welcome. Unfortunately, the advent of malls also really ended this shopping experience. But I guess what goes around comes around, as Amazon has now ended even people going to the mall.
True. And why was it called the Boston store, Jack? Do we know?
Unfortunately, you did more research than I did for this, and I'll be honest. Give me 10 minutes and I can tell you.
Well, you can have 10 minutes because I gotta talk about the next one anyway. So, um, for our next artifact, we decided to feature a spool of thread produced by Barber Flax Mill. And part of the reason for that is because they are right down the street from us in Spruce Street. Now, Paterson, as most of our viewers are going to know, is best known for the production specifically of silk. And that's why we're the Silk City. However, in its 230 plus years, Paterson has never been a one product town. And we have also not ever been a one fiber town. Our earliest textile manufacturing, some people might be surprised to learn, was actually cotton and not silk. And even when we were in the midst of our silk production in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, we also had the Barber family here in Paterson who established their linen thread and flax manufacturing company. And they came in the 1860s. Now, those of you who are health conscious might be familiar with flax seeds, adding that to your food. This is flax. Flax is an organic material, but not like silk, which comes from silkworms. Flax starts out as a plant. So we have green flax growing in the fields here, and then this shows you what flax would look like after it's been cut and bundled to be processed. There are many stages required to transform flax into fiber, including ripping, which removes the seeds, which you can see on the left, and breaking, which begins to loosen the stalks. And these images are showing the process as it would have been done by hand. By the time the barbers came to Paterson, these steps would have been automated. And here we see a flax spinning wheel on the left from the 1700s and its mechanical replacement on the right. Here's the Barber Thread Works located on Spruce Street. As I said, our neighbors down the street here, and the building is still standing. The Barber family began working with flax in their native Scotland and eventually moved production to Northern Ireland before coming to the United States. Here are some different views of the company's buildings here in Paterson. Now, one of the Barbers, this is Thomas Barber, came to the United States in 1849, and he began working for the family business as a broker first in 1852. But in 1864, he was joined by a brother, Robert, and the two of them came to Paterson and began manufacturing. And this is the first time the Barber family is manufacturing flax here in the United States. By 1867, they employed 450 people. Today, the Barber Flax Mill is home to the Paterson Arts and Science Charter School, which this is the view of that building from Grand Street. And if you're interested in the Barber family's history, I recommend you check out Richard Polton's presentation that he did, which is on our YouTube channel, which is about Senator W. Warren Barber and the Barber family of Paterson. And like I said, you can find that on our YouTube channel. Today, when someone says Hinchliffe, most people immediately think we're talking about the stadium here in Paterson. However, this bottle is representative of an older part of the Hinchliffe family history. The the bottle, which reads, and I'll read it for you because the picture it's not great, says Hinchliffe Brewing and Malting Company, Paterson, New Jersey. It's one of over 200 glass bottles that we have in the museum collection today, and we selected it to demonstrate how ordinary everyday items can help to tell the history of a place like Paterson. Here is the Hinchliffe Brewery. And this brewery business was started by John Hinchliffe Sr. as the Eagle Brewery in 1861. He built on this location Governor Street on the corner of Ann in 1867. During his lifetime, the business had several names to accommodate various partners. But by the time of his death in 1886, the company was known as Hinchliffe and Company. The brewery we see in these images was enlarged and improved following John's death, and part of the building still stands on Governor Street here today. Oops, sorry. When John Sr. died in 1886, he left his business to his three sons, who you can see here in the bottom corner. John, who became president, William F., who became vice president, and James C., who is secretary and treasurer. They renamed the company Hinchliffe Brothers. And then again in 1890, they changed the name again to Hinchliffe Brewing and Malting Company, which is when our bottle must date from. And you can see here from the letterhead, the eagle remained a part of their marketing and sales. According to Charles Schreiner, one of the Paterson's historians, the company could produce 75,000 barrels of beer a year. And so just to make the connection with the stadium, because there is an actual connection, John Hinchliffe Jr. served as mayor of Paterson from 1897 to 1903, and he's the one in the top of the picture above his father. During the Great Depression, his nephew, also named John, which creates some confusion, but often known as John V. Hinchliffe, served as mayor. And John V. was actually the son of James C. And it's under John V. that the project to build the stadium was initiated. And it's for John V. that Hinchliffe Stadium was named. So there you have the connection. Oops. As I mentioned, this bottle was selected partly to represent the many bottles we have in our permanent collection. And it wasn't until closer inspection of these bottles that I began to realize that Paterson not only had several breweries, but also had which was by no means unusual for an American city, but they also had a large number of bottlers. Here is the 1880 to 1881 directory of Paterson, where we see Paterson had 7 brewers and 3 bottlers. And 20 years later, this is 1902, about 20 years later, we have 11 brewers and 19 bottlers. And that includes many who are bottling spring water. So when we talk about the 200 bottles in our collection, they're actually very representative of all of these different companies and businesses in the city, many of whom, other than the city directories, might have been forgotten.
Continental Can. They were founded back in 1913, and they relocated one of their branches to Paterson. I think they had over 50 subsidiaries throughout the United States, and they would move into the old Wright's Aeronautical Corporation plant number 2 on Getty Ave. Building still stands. And a little bit later, they would erect across the street on Madison Ave would be the warehouse where they have roof deck parking for over 700 cars. In the 50s and 60s and early 70s, Continental Can was the largest employer in Paterson. And typical what they normally made were, of course, beer cans, soda cans. So they were stamped out across the street on the 297 Getty Avenue. We have a couple of blanks in our collection, which I like. It makes sound for music too. But outside of that, Continental Can, I can recall some of these things where Heather studies this history. I remember living part of it. It's funny because we use Continental Can's warehouse to this day. Not as a plug, but Carl Stein that does all the signs in the museum. They're located in that in a very small portion of the plant. Continental Can had about 1.6 million square feet in Paterson, unfortunately, until they moved out. And again, we have a number of pieces in our artifact collection, and the tray is one of the unique one, including the one for the Veterans Club banquet. Oh, I missed some of the shots. This is where they welcome Mayor Mike DeVita, welcoming Continental Can in September of 1949. So the building was really only vacant for about a year or so. And the city of Patterson was fortunate that they could find someone to occupy, because when Wrights left, they left about 2.3 million square feet of warehousing and manufacturing building empty for the, fortunately for future operations such as Continental Can. Next one. Continental Can was regularly, though they were definitely a unionized place, and they that could trace back from 1913 silk strikes out early. We were always a hotbed for labor, and Continental Can also had its share. During World War II, even though they weren't here, Continental Can was also, since they were specializing in metal, they also were making munitions and various tank components as well. But we got them a little bit later for our can collection. One of my favorite pieces in the collection, the griddle. As you can see from there, this is an original builder's plate from Rogers, Ketchum, and Grosvenor, which was established by Thomas Rogers here in 1837. This probably would have been the front of a locomotive. We're not 100% sure why it was even turned into a griddle. So the newest this could be is 1856. Probably what we'd have to look at is that may have been recycled during times when it was slow, because Rogers at his height could employ about 2,000 men, but if not much was going on, it would go down to about 35, and they had some extra pieces. They could, sell them through the machine shop. And next slide. When this plate would have been made, this is what the company would have looked like on the lower right-hand corner. That's looking down Spruce Street on the corner of Market and Spruce. Pretty much where you see the three buildings, including the bell tower there and the Central Foundry. That's where the museum's located today in the 1873 erecting shop. The upper left is where the works began in 1837, and you can see we were not only literally an encroachment on the forest, but we're also pretty much the end of the street, and all the early industries up until 1859 itself were powered by the raceway system that you see on the right-hand side. And of course, the raceway system is one of the most important historical pieces in the city, because that's really what gave us our national park status. Rogers Works would grow, though, from that one locomotive that they produced in 1837 to they got a peak where every other working day they could produce a locomotive. Some of their high year productions were about 240 locomotives that were used throughout the world. The most perfectly preserved engine you can see was the 1843 La Junta, which is in Havana to this day at their train museum. And there's even working locomotives from the 1870s, next slide, that you can see in New Zealand. Rogers at its height would encompass, you can see, just almost 3 blocks of manufacturing. When you see that the photo, just the little one in the center is our building. Everything that's pretty much gone except the offices, foundry, and millwright, which are across the street from us. The large building on the upper right is where Burger King is today. So the entire Burger King parking lot was would become our future erecting shop. Our parking lot is where the boiler and hammer shops are, and across the street, you can see there was a few more factories. Unfortunately, after they moved out by 1915, little by little, all these buildings were razed, and in some places are just still vacant. Rogers was the largest manufacturer of locomotives between 1850 and 1860, and really one of the most innovative one. We're fortunate that we also have some shots of workers every now and then. There are no images of our works as an erecting shop, but the building across the street, we recently have one. Next. That's the best shot I have that can show, the actual locomotives. And what's a little bit different than the way they were done here is that you can see that they're done in series. And there was actually an overhead crane system that would lift the boilers on. When you come visit the museum, you'll see we have 12 bays, and each locomotive would have been loaded by hand and propped up and blocked up to get in there. Next slide to give you an idea. Really, nobody really could get through the Rogers Locomotive Works area. You didn't drive through Spruce Street or walk through Spruce Street. It was normally littered with parts because both sides of the street were, were feeding each other with parts, and everything would come together at the assembly shop here where the museum is. But we are quite fortunate to have that early piece. It's the earliest piece we have of the locomotive building. This one's a little bit of an enigma for years, the owl reading machine. You can see what the reel is. The reed is that steel, looks like a comb-like device. And you can barely see it, but sticking through it almost looks like a tongue depressor with a little hook in it. And this is where normally the long waist threads or the warp threads would be threaded through the dents. The dents are the spaces between the thin pieces of metal. This was developed by the Owl Specialty Company around 1908, and it was used for ribbon looms, which makes sense. A ribbon loom is a loom that would weave a product that was 12 inches or less, as opposed to broad looms, which are mainly 3 feet and larger. This was, though, a specialty trade. Next slide, because the one thing we're able to really come up with, besides having one of the original pieces, is in the 1920s. They were still including Dexter Lambert and Company. You know Lambert's Castle. His factories were trying to find someone who could operate a owl ribbon reading machine. Again, made in Paterson, very low production from what we can see. Even coast to coast, I couldn't find another example of it. Next. And it's funny because we do have a lot of pieces here with the label of Alfred Suter, who was a textile engineer and distributor of many products that we have here, mainly for silk testing and all. And they also were the main sole distributor of this piece. So it's unique in an industry that Paterson, really did corner the market.
And so this one really by all accounts should be Jack as well. The textile cart was assigned to me, Jack and I decided, because Jack is a bit obsessed with carts, historic carts in our collection. And if he spoke about this artifact, I don't know that we would get him to stop.
I think we could do a show, The Art of the Cart. It's coming.
So we have actually got several different carts and dollies in the collection. And Jack takes great pride in all of them, in part because he is the one who carried them down the stairs and brought them to the museum in the first place in many cases. We've also discovered in our glass plate negative collection a whole series of black and white photos taken of various carts. You can see Jack smirking there. He's all set for that exhibit. But all joking aside, this is actually a very interesting artifact. It's one that I think most people, when they visit the museum, overlook. And while we're thinking about the industries in Paterson, the textile industry in particular, but any of them really, we focus on the exciting machines and the production process, but it's these sort of everyday artifacts like the carts and the dollies are just as important for how these buildings and these industries functioned. And probably in some ways, these are the more common things that most people, most workers came in contact with. So that's why we picked this cart. And this particular cart, you'll notice in the earlier picture, it has hinges. It has a very interesting feature. If you unlatch it, the hinges allow for it to drop open for more easy loading in the front. And that's the only cart we have like that, right, Jack?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So it's quite cool.
Another product, had no idea research came up with this. Actually, this piece was founded for us by the president of the Paterson Museum Foundation, who's always scurrying, whether it's eBay and auction houses for Paterson memorabilia. And he ran across this SIP electric and machine company piece, the ball bearing measuring reel. And I was like, yeah, we want it. I'd never seen one before. I didn't even know SIP made quite a few of our winders, the warpers, the sexier large machinery that you encounter at the museum. And we did have a couple of measuring devices like this. What this measuring device does, it can actually measure anywhere from 500 to 5,000 yards. And it'll tell you how much yarn the length of a skein, or again, I'm a little small here, but like the quill that would sit inside a shuttle, which brings the filling thread or the weft. So it would tell you how much yarn could actually fit on there. So you would measure it, say it was like 300 yards, and you would know how many of these you would have to wind based on the measurement that you would get off of this device. By being built ball bearing, it was also all enclosed, as you can see. We have several other ones, and they all have cut gears, which if you weren't careful as you were turning them, you could actually either get a finger caught or some of your clothing. The manufacture of this in 1908, it was, I thought this was from the 20s, but we're able to find an advertising piece for it as well. And the way this would operate, actually, it rotates. It makes 5 complete rotations per crank. And again, being all ball bearings, everything is sealed and it's very efficient. It has 2 measuring devices. One's an outer wheel, and then there's an inner wheel. And really, mainly the thing is that you would just unravel it to find how much yarn a particular bobbin would hold. Essentially, that's where they would mainly use it. So we're quite fortunate to have this. Where normally when we think the SIP machine company, we're thinking the much larger machinery.
And speaking of the larger machines involved in the silk industry, our jacquard loom is probably our largest, if definitely one of, if not the largest one we have. Um, and I think many people would say this is the most important artifact that we have in the museum to tell the story of Paterson. The jacquard loom was patented by Joseph Marie Jacquard in 1804, and he borrowed heavily from earlier inventions. We were using borrowed in quotations there. Um, what made this loom special is that it allowed for the weaving of a diverse number of patterns. So the jacquard loom, and specifically the card system that was developed for it, actually is the inspiration for early computers as well. This particular machine was donated by F. Schumacher and Company when they were located in Woodland Park, but it had been used here in Paterson um, at their Paterson location first. And this loom dates sometime between 1868, or sorry, 1968 and 1973. But the head, which you can't see in this picture, and you often can't see at the museum because it's above, is older and dates to about the 1940s. This item and all of the machinery in the textile exhibit are important not only to the history of Paterson, but also to the history of the Paterson Museum. Their acquisition in the 1990s really helped the museum transition its focus to include the technology and development behind the many industries that made Paterson successful. And Jack can speak a little bit more on that if he wants to, because he was involved, as I indicated with the cart, in acquiring all of this textile machinery in the first place.
We picked up this loom from F. Schumacher and Company. They originally had manufacturing in Paterson, then they had moved out to actually Midland Park. And then in the early 90s, I think it was 91 or so, they wanted to get a variance to expand the works, but because it was so residential there, they didn't want any more noise in the neighborhood. So unfortunately, they shut down. And that's how we were able to acquire the 2 looms. As Heather mentioned, that you have 2 vintages there. The Jacquard head is from the 40s, and the OFS Jacquard loom on the bottom is around circa 1970. Pretty much any loom can be converted to a Jacquard loom. I do have to say though, we were quite fortunate because Ronatex Textiles used to be across the street from us, in again the old Rogers Millwright building, and the shop, not the shop steward, the shop loom fixer Ricky helped me take this apart, because you see that it looks like a string art design. Those are the jacquard neck cords. There's actually 5,500 of them there. It took him 2.5 hours to disassemble it. It took him 2.5 weeks to put it back together again, because when you look at those, they're actually hand tied to the top of the jacquard head. And when you pull just one of those cords, it just pulls one individual string. Sorry, Heather.
No, no, it's okay.
I won't keep going.
So we believe the first jacquard looms were used in Paterson by Pilgrim and Meyer, which you can see here, and that was in or around 1873. The mill was located on the corner of Ward and Railroad Avenue and run by Charles Pilgrim and Oscar Meyer. No jokes here about Oscar Mayer wieners. I don't think it's a relation. While silk manufacturing began in Paterson in the late 1830s, with silk being wound on bobbins, it was the introduction of the jacquard looms, which eventually, especially during the period after the Civil War, that really set Paterson on a path to becoming the Silk City. And with so many more options now with the jacquard loom for patterns, for the silk patterns produced here in Paterson, we had a much wider variety of applications for them, including not only clothing, but also upholstery. I included this slide because I think it's important for us to remember that while the Paterson Museum has one jacquard loom as an example, the factories themselves would have been filled with these looms. And the crowded atmosphere would make these huge machines feel much smaller and definitely make the people operating them feel a bit smaller. And all of the noise of the machines running at the same time would have been daunting, I think. And so these machines are amazing marvels of technology, but we also have to remember that they also produced intense and sometimes dangerous working environments for the weavers who operated them. And so the older image on this left is sort of showing you can see the head in that picture very well up at the top. And then the picture on the right is showing one of the mills after it had closed, but you kind of get the sense of just how many of these machines would be all lined up together.
The most important part, of course, of the silk industry is the actual raw silk. Up into the 1830s, America thought we could raise our own, silk filigrees or and run cereal culture. That's where the actual process of taking the cocoon and winding it into silk thread. Although it was real labor intensive. Well, again, up until the 1830s, they were promising, we'll give you some seeds, you can plant the mulberry tree, and particularly the white mulberry, which is not indigenous to the United States, but because of that little craze in period, it's very, invasive, and you could find it in almost all 50 states. Again, it originated in China, and now we have it everywhere for everyone who tried to make, an amazing living back in the 1830s. When they brought silk here, 84% of it came from China, another 14 or so from Japan. So it was really, Asia that supplied Paterson with its silk. Protective tariffs really started and really helped our industry between 1857 and 1863. So even in the middle of our Civil War, we're worried about putting tariffs on finished goods, primarily silk shirts, silk dresses from England and France, and raw silk came in at 0% tariff, so there's no tax added. Now, the silk came, throughout China, and each, place made its own, just like every other manufacturing. I used to joke that these kind of remind me of like beer labels, and that's pretty much what the chop tickets are. They indicate, where the raw silk was manufactured. Although they really are an art form into themselves, we have a collection of over 200 of them. A couple of years ago, we had a visiting professor from China, and they're coming back actually in the next month or so, and they've been scanning and writing articles because some of the chops that we have, these particular houses where the silk was manufactured, they've never seen these tickets because they again usually when you rip open, like again, you throw a beer away, get rid of it. Normally after they opened up the bales, next slide, the tickets were lost. Really, it's just a little label. This is the way raw silk would come. It would, it was shipped across the Passaic. The Passaic River is important, but a little bit further than that, the Pacific Ocean. And once it would arrive in the normally around San Francisco, it would take the Silk Express and it would make its way here. And it came in these bales. The average bale weighs about 133 pounds, and they're just real bundles. If you were to, they look like braids. If you were to open one up, they're anywhere from 1.5 to 3 feet in circumference, and they could, run several thousand yards. But this is the way raw silk would come into the country. And here you can see where they're opening up. You get a better idea. They were actually wrapped in bamboo shoots, and normally that label would be tucked inside. And then, again, normally it was discarded. Nobody really collected them because they were only interested here in getting the raw silk, because then it was going to go through the, the bleaching, the dyeing, and the weaving and get it out. But, these are a little unique piece to give us an idea, where the raw silk originated from.
Yeah, and the as you said, the images on them are really beautiful. I scanned a bunch of them, and was doing some research, and they're very. There's one sort of recurring, I guess you would call it it's not really a god. It's like a
Chrysanthemum?
character. No, a character from their
Oh,
from Asian mythology. It's a turtle with a tail, and it has something to do with this. Actually, is naturally occurring. The turtles move so little, they grow this kind of like algae that like is like a tail, and it's a part of this larger myth about the turtle, and it's like a good luck symbol essentially. And that shows up on a lot of the Chop tickets. Sometimes in being a main feature and sometimes being sort of, but they're really, really interesting as you get into them. Very, um, very detailed. So, and really beautiful, colorful as well.
that'll be a future exhibit that'll be online
Yes, I
after
think it would be
together.
a really good one to have a virtual exhibit of. And here I am again. So this is our royal hole punch for the Jacquard card. And to better explain why, because it just kind of looks like a oversized hole punch, why it's so important, we need to look first at the Jacquard cards themselves. Um, so Jack actually is the one who originally recommended this artifact, and I was a little bit skeptical at first, but I realized after a little while that it was a really good choice because this hole punch is really important for the development of and processing of the Jacquard cards, which, as we just talked about earlier, the Jacquard looms were so important to Paterson. So you see the loom again here, and I've circled in red. You see these things hanging. Those are the Jacquard cards, and there are some here on the left as an example to show you they're the pattern that the machine reads through the head so that it can develop the pattern with its weaving and get whatever the design is that was developed. And so the hole punch is there in case the automated system kind of makes a mistake. And here is another picture just showing you the cards from a different perspective hanging from the loom. Um, and this is Mr. John Royal, who I think we've talked about already in one of our previous programs from this series, and we will probably talk about him again, I think. And his company, John Royal and Sons, was one of the many machine works companies here in Paterson that produced machines needed for all the different products that were made here in Paterson. So obviously, because they were making things for everybody, textiles was one of their big lines that they produced a lot of textile machinery. And so our hole punch is one of the more modest parts of that. Again, we're talking about the big sexy machines versus the little machines here. We've featured a lot of the little machines in this presentation. The hole punch actually, oops, sorry, is a part of a larger process. Now, Royal and Sons created this machine, which we have on display at the museum, and this is the card lacer, which they developed. This automates the process of stringing all of those cards together. And then once you have them strung together, you would actually put them in another Royal machine, and this is the repeater. And once you have the prototype card that usually was done by hand, which Jack will talk about in a few minutes, then you could put it in this machine and it would essentially Xerox or replicate it over and over and over again. However, as we all know from automated machines, every once in a while the punches would either not be quite right or they wouldn't go through all the way. And that's where our little automated hand punch comes in. You're able to go in. Someone who's checking the pattern is able to go in and make those corrections appropriately. And the repeater is actually one of my favorite machines in the whole museum, but we didn't feature it in this exhibit, but I had to get it in there somehow. That's why I put it in now.
It's like the Xerox machine for the card
I just
industry.
love it. I just think it's so cool. So the ever since I started working in Paterson, which was over a decade ago, I have absolutely loved the ribbons that were made here. And if anybody's from Paterson, many of you will be familiar with these historic ribbons. They kind of show up on eBay and stuff like that all the time. I just think they're really cool, and I love the level of detail in them. And I also like that they seem to have been created at any possible commemorative moment. Some of them very, commemorative worthy, like World's Fairs, and others, I would argue, not quite so important. But they made a ribbon anyway. And I'm also an avid reader, and I think that the bookmark quality of a lot of these ribbons is really neat as well. And I find them really appealing. And as you can imagine, we have many ribbons that were produced here in Paterson in the museum's collection. And so we featured this one as a prime example. And part of it is because it is in such good shape with its attached paperwork and original, I guess you would call that packaging as well. So this ribbon is showing the newly elected president, Grover Cleveland, prominently. And that's because this was from the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial exhibition in New Orleans in 1884. And he had just been recently elected when that exhibition took place. And I should clarify that these were not only made to commemorate a moment, but these were actually made on site in New Orleans. And that's another part of these ribbons that I find, particularly these commemorative ones, that I find really fun. So the majority of ribbon making in Paterson, it was not focused on creating these short bookmark style ribbons. Usually the ribbon looms were used for anything 12 inches wide or smaller. And that included ribbons for dress trimming, men's ties, hat bands. And there were many, many different firms in Paterson that either completely focused or had some of their manufacturing focused on making ribbons. This is an image of the outside of the Paterson Ribbon Company. Again, just one example of the ribbon companies here. And this is the interior of a ribbon factory here in Paterson. Now you can see that the jacquard loom technology is being utilized here, but the ribbon looms are set up to weave thinner strips of textile rather than the broadcloth that we saw on the looms that we've seen earlier in this presentation. Now, as I mentioned, the ribbon that we're showing on exhibit here at the museum is commemorating specifically the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial exposition, and it was produced on site there. Here are two pictures of the main entrance of that exhibition in New Orleans, Louisiana. Now, starting with Prince Albert's Great Exhibition in 1851 in London, people became obsessed with this idea of World's Fair style events, great exhibitions, and cities use them as a way to drive tourism and highlight innovation, both local innovation and invite people from the outside. And one of the features of many of these exhibitions and events were the exhibition halls where actual working machinery was demonstrating all the different industries that were produced of all kinds. And so many Paterson silk factories would participate in these live demonstrations and be present at these exhibitions, which sometimes lasted for a year. So they would have, their setup and have somebody there operating. And this is what I just love about them, and what I think is brilliant about these. When they operated the looms, while they were operating them, they were producing the commemorative ribbons that they then turned around and sold to the spectators, which I just think is neat. So you could actually watch your ribbon being made and then go ahead and purchase it. And I'm sure that the weavers were not the only ones toting souvenirs. I'm pretty sure all of the manufacturers were doing this in some form or another, but I just feel like it's a really great business move that you have your machines there running anyway. So you might as well be trying to cash in on, the phenomenon of the World's Fair or whichever one you're at. And here's another example of the same kind of setup at a different fair. This is a photo of the Phoenix Mill from Paterson, and they are exhibiting in this picture in 1878 at the Paterson exhibition. Now, John Best and Company of Paterson also exhibited at the Columbian exhibition, which took place in Chicago and sometimes is known as the Chicago World's Fair. And according to one history of the fair that I found that was published in the same year, John Best of Paterson, New Jersey, shows also a loom weaving badges, bookmarks, and souvenirs of various kinds in the machinery hall. So we can see that they're all doing this. Now, one of the reasons that they would participate as well is they could be given honors and awards, and then they could sort of include that in their letterhead and promote that as well for their business. And here are some, here are some more examples of some of the bookmarks and ribbons that we have in our collection. These are just a few. And as you can see from both the two different Lindbergh ones that we have and also the two different Home Sweet Home, they can be varied very slightly and mostly the same ribbon without being exactly identical. With Home Sweet Home, they just kind of changed out the blue for the green. And Lindbergh, we have these two different versions of Lindbergh, the longer one, and then a shorter version that just kind of commemorates him slightly. And they might have been produced, with similar, using some of the same parts of the pattern, in the case of Lindbergh's. Okay.
This is where I think our numbering system's a little backwards because we weren't labeling these initially for, for a PowerPoint presentation. This is really where the process begins with jacquard weaving. You got to start with a drawing or a sketch. This one's rather colorful. We just picked this up recently. We've just got thousands of samples from Valenta and Sons, who's been in business for a number of years in Paterson, and then they moved over to Hawthorne. They still have a couple of looms. They're also weaving their own original products, but they gave us, again, copious amounts of designs, which, again, in and of themselves would make a lovely art exhibition. So as I said, the jacquard designer starts, this would be for an upholstery fabric. Draw it out, you like it, now it's got to, get to the weaving process. Next slide. Here it would be brought to a point paper design, which essentially it's graph paper. And what we're doing here is we have to figure out how many different threads have to be lifted and lowered, or, the separation of the warp and the weft, or the warp and the filling threads. And that has to be calculated, on graph paper. Again, everything's just running at perpendicular lines. Now, the colors that you see on the graph paper do not reflect the final fabric. You can see the pattern here in the red and blue, and then you see the fabric sample next to it. That's what it's actually manufacturing. These brilliant colors are painted, and some of them are multicolor, just so the jacquard card cutter who's going to read this can figure out which end he has to punch the hole in. This is all for the jacquard carding industry. So these are, vibrant colors. So, he can see what colors got to go up and down. Next slide. And this is the type of machine. Again, this is also a John Royal piece. This is the Royal card cutter. And you can see the pattern there. Again, you got the reds, the blues, and you not only have the spears, but also the running pattern. And the two lines there indicate, where you would follow to make the card cut. They call it the piano card style cutter because it looks like a gentleman's playing the piano. He's actually operating a set of key punches on both in the front and behind his hand. So your thumb and all your fingers are engaged. On the bottom below the large comber board, you see the cards themselves. On the left side is blank cards, and on the right is when you cut them, because they have to be kept, of course, in sequential order. So if you have 1,000, let's say it takes 1,000 pieces of string to make your rose or whatever you've sketched out to come to life and then repeat itself, you're going to cut 1,000 cards, and then they would go to the lacer. Also, we may have mentioned this earlier in the previous thing. John Royal actually began as his job as a machinist, as an apprentice here at the Rogers Works, and he started working in the basement of his home in 1855, and that's pretty much where John Royal and Sons would begin. Today, they still exist. They moved out of Paterson in the 70s, and they're now part of Royal Systems and manufacturing mainly extruding or tubing machinery for covering copper wire and other type of tubing in Oakland, New Jersey. And I think this is our last one for today. This is Wright's most powerful and largest engine, the R3350. The 3350 stands for 3,350 cubic inches, and R, of course, for it's a radial air-cooled engine. Actually, this is an 18-cylinder. This particular engine is a turbo compound engine in that it has turbocharging, but it's essentially two 9-cylinder engines put together with the slightly off canter, so the rear cylinder can get some air, and you can see it's pretty narrow between the two cylinders that you're looking here. This particular engine that we have, you see the brightly colored yellow. It looks like a plug for an outlet. There's actually monitoring gear. So this one was never really attached to an airplane, but this was a test cell model. They were vigorously testing their engines, always trying to increase the horsepower. And that's really what the turbo option does. Next. But turbo powering did it right. My favorite shot of Wright's in the assembly line production. Assembly line production, just, when I'm trying to always tie all the industries, We had Sam Colt, the inventor of the firearm, not the inventor of the revolver, rather. But what he did is he brought the factory system to firearm building, assembly line production. His assembly line began in Paterson, 1837. 100 years later, we're still manufacturing with assembly line production. This particular engine is a little smaller. This is the 14-cylinder engine, but it's nice that it's on its side so you can see the two rows of engines. This is the G200, which would have been in the B-25 bomber program. The 18-cylinder R3350 next is what powered the B-29 bomber program. So the engine we have is actually a little bit later vintage. It's probably around 1949, 50. That's when they started introducing turbo power. With the efficiency of turbos, what that did is it made the engine crank out almost a maximum of 4,000 horsepower. During the B-29 era, maximum horsepower was between 22 and 2,800 horsepower. So it made it far more efficient. The engine itself actually was introduced to the world at the 1939 World's Fair when Wrights wanted to show, the achievement and how big they could make these engines. However, they didn't really have a plane that they were sticking on, to stick it on immediately. So it had a number of issues. One was cooling, oil leaking. But during the Pacific Theater, we needed the long range bomber program. The United States military wanted this engine and it needed high production. And so what happened is they were able to get the Chrysler Corporation involved with Wrights, and at the Chicago plant, the Dodge plant rather, what they would do is they took apart our engine, rebuilt it, and they figured out some of the cooling issues. And under Wright's licensing agreement, they produced about 18,500. Here in Paterson, we started producing it, but we were more concentrating on the B-17 and B-25 of the R-1820 and, as I said, the 14-cylinder engine. So they actually built the Woodridge plant, which Wrights would eventually, consolidate everything under one roof in Woodridge, and that's where they were sole production for the B-29 bomber. But once the war in Europe was over, the Paterson plants were converted to making all parts and some assembly. So B-29 was our main engine towards the end of the war, where it would later be used. Nice cutaway version, can give you an idea. Actually, each engine with the Hamilton standard prop weighs about 6,000 pounds. So the plane alone has 24,000 pounds of engine alone to propel this, behemoth of the sky as it was, the super fortress. Commercial aviation would later use it to power the Constellation and the Super Constellation, as you see here, and also the C-130. Unfortunately for Wrights, they really didn't embrace the jet age. They really thought the turbo compound engine was the way to go, and they were right about the efficiency. But of course, the jet age did win out. They did make the J65, which was essentially a British Sapphire engine, which they had Wrights had licensing agreement from England, so they could produce it here, and it was used really like in the F-84 during the Korean theater. But by then they were long out of Paterson as they'd relocated. By 1946-47, they had closed all the Paterson plants down, and that was the end for Wrights.
And if
And
you're
today's
interested in
presentation.
rights, and this is the first you're hearing Jack talk about it, Jack has actually done a 3-part series on the history of Wrights Aeronautical in Paterson, which is on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much for joining us for this 3rd installment of our webinar series, sharing the details and the stories behind our 100 artifacts. As I said, this video was recorded, and like the previous 2, will be available on the museum's YouTube channel. Give me about a week. So you can rewatch it if something we said was so phenomenal you need to hear us say it again. If you need to catch up or you want to share it with a friend, you'll be able to do that as well. And please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel if you haven't already, so that you'll get the regular updates if you don't attend the live programs. Now, to find us, you just go to YouTube and type in the Paterson Museum, and our channel is one of the first things that pops up. Our next presentation, which is part 4 of 5, will take place on Tuesday, November 18th at 2 p.m. And so if by registering for this program, you've given us your email, you should be getting the reminder to sign up for that as well when it gets a little bit closer. Thank you again, as I said, for joining us and for your continued interest and support in the Paterson Museum and what we do here, and particularly in our 100th anniversary celebrations. And Jack, you want to say anything before we
Yeah, I want to thank everyone for continuing with us. We are developing other programs. Myself, I'm developing one on the locomotive era, which I think will be another great topic for me because I've been living it here since I started working here in '89. But I really have to say, really the genius behind all these presentations, I think you may have noticed, it's really our curator, Heather Garside. She's got us, active in social media, so you can follow us. I don't know where we'd be without Heather, and she's the one who's really developed these programs. And just, I have to thank you, Heather, and again, and thank you all because I know you're coming back here because of her. Thank you, Heather.
So thank you. It's fun. So, all right. So thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you November 18th. And look, I will send out an email to let everybody know when this video is up and live on our YouTube channel so that you can feel free to share it with all your friends. So until November 18th, thank you and goodbye.
Bye bye.